During sorority rush, we used quiet signals to communicate without having to say, "Hi, I'm here to steal your seat because I have way more in common with this young woman than you do." When things were going south during a conversation, we would make eye contact with another sister and play with our hair. It was a bat signal asking for help. Naturally, this bled into the rest of our lives. If we were out and got bad vibes, we'd make eye contact with a sister and play with our hair. You don't really have to be all that subtle or creative with drunk men at parties. I once interrupted a conversation and said only, "I need to take her with me now." It worked like a charm. Feel free to take our move and use it with your friends. It's a lot smoother than sending an SOS text message. Of course, not all interactions with drunk men occur in public spaces. There aren't always a bunch of witnesses that can explain what happened or otherwise intervene. When a series of cameras tracked Specialist Second Class Coleman to a back room and recorded his suspect interactions with a woman, there was undoubtedly bukus of proof as to what happened. And investigators let that proof disappear. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. When Operations Specialist Second Class Riley Coleman and his friends clambered into Key West, Florida on a night of liberty, they quickly set to work knocking a few back. They were, after all, sailors. Discontent to remain in one location, the trio found themselves paying the cover and slipping through the doors at Teasers, a fully nude, full bar catering to men in South Florida. In looking up Teasers, I began to wonder whether 3.2 stars on Google and 3.1 stars on Yelp is good, bad, or just a reflection of who takes the time to sit down and write a review of nudie clubs. There seems to be a mix of people bummed about liquor laws, upset that dancers didn't check if men had romantic entanglements before dancing for them, and furious that bouncers removed them. That final category of complaints reads, to me, mostly like a series of tiny confessions of entitlement. What a choice to link that to your online presence. Soon after Coleman and his friends arrived at Teasers, Coleman purchased a $300 private dance and followed someone we're going to call Scarlett into a back room. Teasers understood their clientele and the dangers that come with allowing private dances for men in back rooms with women who are wearing little or no clothing. The club and the back rooms were wired with an extensive surveillance system of closed-circuit cameras and captured Coleman and Scarlett entering the room and the activities that followed. Once they were in the private room, Scarlett began dancing. She wasn't fully nude, she had at least a scrap of underwear on, enough to provide a barrier between her vulva and Coleman's wandering and uninvited hands. When Coleman reached out and touched her, Scarlett reacted by slapping him in the face. This upset Coleman, who again reached out, shoving Scarlett with both hands twice, pushing her onto a bench. Scarlett left the room, summoning her manager, who we're going to call Mr. Bell. Mr. Bell called Key West police, who then arrested Coleman. The police left without collecting the various surveillance camera footages. Nothing in the private room, nothing of Coleman and Scarlett walking to the private room, none of the aftermath. Instead, Mr. Bell held his cell phone camera up to the review screen and filmed a 29-second clip of the incident. No one did anything to otherwise preserve the footage. Something similar came up in episode 46, Texas versus Murphy. There, an apartment complex overwrote the footage from security cameras outside a murdered woman's apartment when law enforcement failed to request a copy during the early stages of their investigation. In that episode, I suggested that maybe if you're a property manager and one of your tenants is found murdered, just preserve the footage because it'll be useful eventually. Mr. Bell tried to do just that with his short recording of a recording. That 29-second clip revealed Coleman, seated, and Scarlett dancing on him while facing away from him. 5 seconds into the clip, Coleman reached between Scarlett's legs, after which she turned and slapped him. In an interview with Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents 4 months after the fact, Coleman asserted that Scarlett touched his genitals over his clothing, so he responded by doing the same. Which sure sounds like an admission that he touched Scarlett. And Scarlett's actions seemed consistent with Mr. Bell's description of the services offered at Teasers, a club that he described as a, quote, full friction club. Dancers touch customers, sit on their laps, and rub their bodies on the customers. In return, customers are able to fondle dancers' breasts and buttocks, which, call me a prude, I'm personally scandalized by. The blanket reciprocity policy might be constrained to specific areas, but it would seem to create these gray areas for drunks or predators. It gives me the ick to hear that the club gave consent on their dancers' behalf instead of leaving it to the women to assess what they were comfortable with and from whom. Ugh. The footage the court later reviewed seemed to suggest that quote-unquote touching that Coleman described was Scarlett giving Coleman a lap dance. The thing he paid her for and therefore specifically requested. Touching her beyond the areas of the breasts or buttocks was something that I'll note does not seem to be something she specifically requested. I don't imagine that Coleman had their self-reflection in that moment to identify that there is an extraordinary power differential between the nearly nude woman and a fully clothed man in a private space. But we can remind ourselves of that dynamic. I also suspect that the police saw this as just sort of the cost of doing business, or at least that's how I interpret their decision to not formally preserve any of the surveillance footage from Teasers. Perhaps they'd had very few assault cases move forward for prosecution, a result that might prompt them to skip that step. But I don't imagine that it's easy to pursue assault charges when the police don't request footage of the assault. Sort of an Ouroboros. Police don't secure the footage, so the cases don't get prosecuted or fail at trial, so police don't see the need to secure future footage. But the Key West police weren't the only investigatory agency involved in the case. The Navy had an interest in what their sailor was up to that led to his arrest by local officials. When NCIS finally tapped into the case months after the fact, they went back to Teasers and asked for the actual footage. Something beyond a limited recording of a recording. But like most businesses, that footage had already been overwritten due to electronic storage constraints. Because investigators failed to obtain the actual surveillance video, Coleman moved to dismiss the charge, which the military judge denied. The judge allowed the recording of a recording, Mr. Bell's testimony, and Coleman's interview to fill the evidentiary gaps created by the Key West police failure to secure the evidence. Notably, Scarlett did not testify. It's not entirely clear when, but I think it was sometime around the ill-fated Liberty. Coleman also tested positive for cocaine in a urinalysis test. During the subsequent court-martial, Coleman's friend testified that while he and Coleman visited a casino, that friend popped open a bag of cocaine in Coleman's car without his knowledge and consumed some. But he was really messy with his illicit drugs and spilled cocaine in the car. A defense expert testified that Coleman's positive urinalysis could be the result of innocently ingesting the cocaine residue left by the cocaine explosion. The government relied primarily on the permissive inference that Coleman, who did not have a medical chit for the consumption of cocaine, wrongfully consumed the cocaine discovered in his system. A panel of enlisted sailors and naval officers convicted Coleman of one specification of abusive sexual contact for reaching between Scarlett's legs, one specification of assault consummated by a battery for repeatedly shoving Scarlett after being slapped, and one specification of the wrongful use of cocaine. They acquitted him of a separate specification of assault consummated by battery upon a law enforcement officer, and I have no additional details to offer you about what happened there. The members sentenced Coleman to a confinement for 120 days, reduction from E5 to E1, forfeiture of $2,017 per pay period for 4 months, and a bad conduct discharge. On appeal, Coleman advanced 3 assignments of error. He argued first that the military judge abused her discretion when she found that the testimony of Mr. Bell was an adequate substitute for that missing video footage that had already been destroyed. Second, he argued factual and legal insufficiency to sustain his conviction for the wrongful use of cocaine. Finally, he questioned whether the government violated the Confrontation Clause when their substitute expert witness, who did not perform the lab testing on Coleman's urine, conveyed out-of-court statements of the other lab analyst who actually performed the test. Coleman argued that he should have had the opportunity to question the actual lab analyst who performed the actual work. Turning to that first issue, when evidence is lost or tossed, the military judge has to consider whether the errant evidence is essential to a fair trial, whether there is an adequate substitute for the evidence, and whether the accused is at fault or could have prevented the unavailability of the evidence. If the evidence is essential, there's no substitute for it, and the accused wasn't at fault, the accused is entitled to relief at trial. An investigator's failure to secure evidence isn't necessarily fatal to a case. Murphy still got convicted of double homicide in Texas even though the police didn't secure the apartment footage. There was also a ton of evidence in that case. Here we have the fuzzy memory of a strip club manager, backed up by a 29-second clip of a recording against the word of a sailor, who admittedly was drunk on the night in question. The Navy and Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals considered how much missing time, how many missing interactions, that substitute evidence excluded. They also considered how misaligned Mr. Bell's testimony was with the relevant details. For instance, during his testimony at court-martial, he described Scarlett as clothed, but that video clip that he himself preserved showed she was in only her underwear. So even though Mr. Bell said that he never saw Scarlett touch Coleman's crotch in the destroyed video evidence, he wasn't the most reliable narrator. It made it harder for a fact finder to get the full picture, to assess whether Coleman had a reasonable belief that Scarlett consented to being touched. The NMCCA also considered testimony elicited by the defense at other times during the court-martial, testimony as to the full contact from dancers for other patrons of the club. Although it of course didn't go to whether Scarlett consented on the night in question, the court pondered what sort of culture actually existed at teasers, and what mistakes someone might reasonably make. Taking all of that into account, the NMCCA concluded that the lost video was of central importance, that it was essential to a fair trial, and that the military judge abused her discretion when she determined that the substitute evidence was adequate. That conclusion prompted the court to hold that the proceedings should have been abated with regard to the abusive sexual contact charge. Coleman also argued that missing evidence meant that his conviction for assault consummated by battery should be tossed. At court-martial, Coleman had argued that he'd acted in self-defense when he shoved Scarlett after she slapped him. And he didn't allege that there was anything in the missing footage that was relevant to the assault consummated by battery. The entirety of that charge was wrapped up in those 29 seconds. As to the sufficiency of the evidence for the cocaine consumption conviction, the NMCCA rejected Coleman's argument, concluding the panel considered and rejected the theory that the friend's bag of exploding cocaine led to innocent ingestion and a positive drug test. The court further concluded that the substitute drug lab expert didn't violate the confrontation clause, relying on the same reasoning that the court embraced in the Dillenberger case. For more information on that case, I'd go ahead and give episode 62 a listen. In all, the NMCCA dismissed the abusive sexual contact conviction and affirmed the remaining findings of guilt. That change in the convictions changed the sentencing landscape significantly, prompting the court to set aside his sentence. The NMCCA declined to conduct their own resentencing and returned the case for a sentencing rehearing. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductonbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductonbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we take a look at what it means to desert the Army. Repeatedly. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense, or by their new preferred name, the Department of War.